The date of the 21st presidential election was officially set for June 3rd, following the removal of former President Yoon. It's been designated as a temporary holiday. A day before the U.S. so-called reciprocal tariffs take effect, China vows further retaliation against the U.S. if Washington goes ahead with an additional 50% tariff on Beijing. America's trading partners are scrambling to negotiate, among them being South Korea. Samsung Electronics is estimated to have posted an operating profit of $4.5 billion in the first quarter on the back of strong sales of its flagship smartphones. It's April 8th, 8 p.m. in Seoul. This is Newscenter. Thank you for joining us. I'm Yoon Min. The date of the nation's next presidential election has been officially set for June 3rd. Oh Soo-young covers the protocols ahead for the presidential race.
South Korea will hold an early presidential election on June 3rd, 2 months after the removal of former President Yoon. In a meeting chaired by Acting President and Prime Minister Han Duck-soo, Cabinet Ministers on Tuesday confirmed the date of the early election and declared it a temporary holiday to encourage voter turnout. The decision comes 4 days after the Constitutional Court upheld former President Yoon's impeachment over his martial law declaration last year, effectively ousting the nation's 20th president. Under the Constitution, a snap election must be held within 60 days of a presidential vacancy, with a date set within 10 days. While June 3rd is the last possible day to hold the election, it's considered a necessary period of time for sufficient campaigning and preparation. In 2017, following former President Park Geun-hye's removal from office, an election was held 60 days later.
We considered the time required to smoothly execute legally mandated tasks for election management and preparation time for each political party. To ensure citizens can exercise their precious right to vote, we have designated Election Day as a temporary public holiday.
The National Election Commission Tuesday promptly confirmed the election schedule. It will accept candidate registrations on May 10th and 11th before official campaigning starts on the 12th until June 2nd, the day before the vote. Televised interviews and debates hosted by electoral authorities will be held during this time. Overseas Koreans must register to vote 40 days before Election Day, and ballots for them will open from May 20th to 25th at embassies and consulates around the world. Early voting will be held the weekend before, on May 29th and 30th, from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. On the official election day, voting hours will be from 6 a.m. to 8 p.m. To support a fair and transparent electoral process, the Interior Ministry will operate a fair election support situation room through Election Day. A nationwide mock exam for the November college entrance test has been rescheduled to a day later on June 4th. In an early election, the winner must immediately assume presidential duties without a transmission committee. In the 2017 presidential race, then President-elect Moon Jae-in took office straight after his victory was confirmed on May 10th, the day after ballots were cast. Until the leadership vacuum is filled, Acting President Han told cabinet members they must devote themselves fully to ensuring the safety of the people, restoring livelihoods, and responding to the ongoing trade war triggered by the United States. Oh Soo-young, Arirang News.
With the date set, a number of presidential hopefuls are making their moves to join the race. Kim Do-yeon reports.
With the next presidential election officially set for June 3rd, eyes are now on who's going to be running in this relatively short election season. The Democratic Party of Korea, which holds the majority on the floor, does have a clear frontrunner, though he's yet to announce his official candidacy. The party's chair, Lee Jae-myung, who lost the last presidential election to Yoon by just 0.7 points, is expected to resign from the party's leadership as early as Wednesday to make a bid for the presidency. Despite this, there are other DP politicians not from East faction who are going to compete for the candidacy. Kim Do-kwan, former Minister of Interior and Governor of Gyeongsang-namdo Province, as well as a lawmaker, said he will run. Kim Dong-yeon, current Governor of Gyeonggi-do Province, announced that he will formally declare on Wednesday as he leaves for the state of Michigan in the U.S. to deal with tariff issues. As for the People Power Party, there is no frontrunner like its rival, and the primary is expected to have around 10 candidates. First up is lawmaker An Cheol-soo, who held an official press conference on Tuesday declaring his fourth run for presidency. Labor Minister Kim Moon-soo resigned from his post on Tuesday and said he will officially start his campaign on Wednesday. Former PPP chair Han Dong-hoon said his camp will kick off on Thursday, while Daegu Mayor Hong Jun-pyo's camp said his official announcement will be on the 14th of April. The two most watched so far are Kim Moon-soo and Han Dong-hoon. Kim famously refused to apologize for the martial law declaration at the National Assembly when all other cabinet members stood up. Han was the chair of PPP and despite being from the party openly supported the impeachment of President Yoon. Meanwhile, third-party candidates are expected to announce their bids as well. It began with Lee Jun-seok, the new Reform Party chair who was formerly the chair of the PPP, registering as a preliminary candidate already. Kim Do-yeon, Arirang News.
More than 10 North Korean soldiers crossed the military demarcation line at around 5 p.m. on Tuesday at the frontal eastern area of the demilitarized zone. According to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the soldiers retreated after the South Korean military issued warning broadcasts and fired warning shots. The JCS added that the military is closely monitoring the movements of the North Korean forces and is acting in accordance with operational procedures. A day before the U.S. so-called reciprocal tariffs take effect, Washington and Beijing look to be engaged in a game of chicken, each vowing to retaliate without backing down. China vows further retaliation if the U.S. goes ahead with an additional tariff. Moon Hae-ryun explains.
China is threatening further retaliation against the United States should they impose the additional tariff promised by U.S. President Donald Trump. According to the Wall Street Journal, a statement from Beijing's Ministry of Commerce on Tuesday said that it would take countermeasures to safeguard its own rights and interests in response to Trump's social media post, which said Washington could impose an additional 50% tariff on Beijing. The statement called the move a mistake on top of a mistake. Previously, China announced a 34% tariff on American goods in response to U.S. levies, which in turn led to Trump's threat of additional tariffs unless Beijing withdraws these retaliatory tariffs. The escalation of the trade war between the two countries brings the total rate to be levied on Chinese imports to 104%. This is expected to have a staggering impact as China was the second largest trading partner with the U.S. last year. Trump also warns that unless Beijing accepts his demands, its negotiations with the U.S. will come to a standstill. Meanwhile, negotiations with other countries are due to begin immediately. U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said more than 50 countries reached out for talks, while Trump said leaders from Asia and Europe called him over the weekend, as well as Japan's Prime Minister on Monday.
We have many countries that are coming to negotiate deals with us, and they're going to be fair deals, and in certain cases they're going to be paying substantial tariffs. There'll be fair deals.
This marks a shift from earlier statements, which stated that there would be no negotiations for the time being. During interviews with various media outlets, White House officials said that such deals would need to be really great for American manufacturing and farmers, and countries would need to do more than just lowering their tariffs for relief. Moon Hae-ryun, Arirang News.
Meanwhile, countries in Europe and Asia are gearing up different responses, including negotiations with Washington. An Sung-jin takes a look at how the world is tackling the trade war triggered by the U.S.
As Trump's tariffs threaten countries around the world, most have been drafting response measures. Trump's taxes will start with a baseline of 10% on all goods coming into the U.S., with some countries reaching up to 50% on imports. With the reciprocal tariffs on specific countries to begin on April 9th, countries have been ramping up retaliatory measures. Trump has imposed a 20% tariff on goods from the European Union, which stated that it will be defending its interests with countermeasures.
Further diversifying our trade relations is very critical for us because this broadens the market opportunities and is crucial for our companies. So it's very clear that we are open for negotiations, and that in parallel we are preparing a potential list for retaliation and other measures for retaliation if this is necessary.
The 27-country bloc will also be working closely with the UK, and though it has levied 25% tariffs on some U.S. imports, it further made clear that it would prefer a negotiated solution by offering a 0-for-0 tariff deal. Asian countries have also varied in their approach to tariff impositions. U.S. President Donald Trump and Japanese Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba had a 25-minute phone talk on Monday, with the Japanese leader stating that he will dispatch a team for further trade talks. However, Ishiba did voice his disappointment over the tariffs as he noted that Japan had been the biggest investor in the U.S. for 5 straight years. Meanwhile, Vietnam took a conciliatory approach by suggesting it could lower tariffs on U.S. goods to 0, while Malaysia will be drafting a joint response plan at the ASEAN level. Pakistan will be sending representatives to the U.S. for discussions, and the Philippines has also pledged to lower taxes on American imports. However, some countries have also stated that they do not plan to retaliate. India referred to ongoing trade negotiations as it expressed no retaliation efforts, while Taiwan also disclosed no intention for reciprocal trade tariffs as of now against the 32% on Taiwanese goods. The U.S. National Economic Council director said more than 50 countries have reached out to the White House to negotiate trade talks with Washington. Han Sung-jin, Arirang News.
Against this backdrop, a Korean trade delegation led by its trade minister has departed with the U.S. with its intentions to address the 25% American tariff on Korean imports. Park Jun-han has more.
Trade Minister Chung In-kyu traveled to Washington on Tuesday to discuss tariffs imposed by the U.S. on South Korean products. Chung will meet U.S. trade representatives in Washington and emphasized that the 25% tariffs affecting steel and automobiles would be the subject of talks during his visit.
So we are trying to use multiple channels to solve the tariffs issue with the United States and to come up with a trade policy outcome that will maximize South Korea's national interests.
This is the first visit by a South Korean government official to the U.S. since Trump announced his detailed reciprocal tariffs plan on April 2nd. Regarding South Korea's stance on U.S. trade policy, Chung said the cabinet has been discussing the possibility of increasing imports from the United States, such as Alaskan liquefied natural gas. The move is aimed at addressing the trade imbalance that Trump has repeatedly raised.
I think as long as Korea will be willing to provide some concessions to the United States, that we could reduce the tariff rate from 25% to 15% or 10%.
At a ministerial meeting on economic affairs, Finance Minister Choi Sang-mok outlined a plan to create a supplementary budget to combat issues related to trade and AI. Choi said the government is planning to spend 3 to 4 trillion won, about $2.04 to $2.72 billion, to respond to rapid changes in the trade environment and enhance AI competitiveness. Choi also called on the National Assembly to swiftly approve the budget, emphasizing the need to seize this critical window to save South Korea's industries and businesses. Park Jun-han, Arirang News.
As U.S. tariffs rattle global financial markets, the South Korean currency lost substantial ground against the U.S. dollar, weakening to 1,473 won at one point during trade on Tuesday afternoon. This is the one's weakest level against the greenback since the global financial crisis. Accordingly, at an emergency meeting of the country's top economic officials, convened by Finance Minister Choi Sang-mok, authorities acknowledged the vulnerability of the local financial market to external risk factors and agreed to remain vigilant in anticipation of further fluctuations. For the 22nd month in a row, Korea's current account remained in the black, with a surplus of over $7 billion in February. Lee Soo-jin covers the latest findings.
South Korea's current account stayed in the black for the 22nd month in a row in February. According to data from the Bank of Korea on Tuesday, the country logged a near $7.2 billion current account surplus in the second month of the year. This also marks a sharp increase from January's surplus when there were fewer working days on account of the Lunar New Year holiday. It comes as the goods balance, which tracks exports and imports of products and accounts for the largest portion of the current account, recorded an $8.2 billion surplus, also marking a significant increase from the previous month. This extends the surplus streak for the goods balance to 23 consecutive months. Exports rose 3.6% compared to the previous year on strong demand for computers, pharmaceuticals, cars, and IT equipment. But outbound shipments of chips dropped compared to the previous year, a decline recorded for the first time since October 2023.
Exports of lower-value DDR4 memory chips fell slightly in February due to price drops, but picked up again in March despite competition from China. Still, it's something we'll need to watch closely.
The size of the country's service balance once again remained in the red, with a deficit deepening compared to the previous month. This was mostly due to the larger shortfall in the intellectual property account from increased payments by domestic firms to overseas companies for R&D-related royalty fees. When asked about when the impact of U.S. President Donald Trump's tariffs will be felt, the same official said the current account surplus will likely continue through March, with effects starting to show in April, but that while sectors like autos and auto parts will be affected, the impact is expected to be gradual, not immediate. 이수진, Arirang News.
In the corporate arena, Samsung Electronics posted what pundits are calling a resilient first-quarter profit, on the back of strong semiconductor and smartphone demand. Shin Se-byuk has more.
Samsung Electronics, in its earnings guidance on Tuesday, estimated a first-quarter operating profit of 6.6 trillion Korean won, or roughly $4.5 billion. The figure beats market expectations of around $3.5 billion, thanks to strong sales of the tech giant's latest flagship smartphones, despite being down 0.15% from a year earlier. The market had projected weaker earnings due to delayed shipments of its 5th-gen HBM chips and falling memory prices, but brisk sales of the Galaxy S25, launched in February, pushed results well above forecasts. Stronger than expected DRAM shipments also contributed to the upbeat performance. Revenue rose nearly 10% on year to 79 trillion won, or around $54 billion, close to the all-time high of 79.1 trillion won posted in the third quarter of last year. Samsung did not disclose earnings by business division this time. However, market watchers estimate the MX division, which oversees smartphones, posted an operating profit of over $2.7 billion. The Device Solutions division, responsible for semiconductors, is projected to have logged an operating profit of around $681 million. With memory chip prices on the rise, expectations are growing for Samsung's performance in the coming quarters. But an expert warns that uncertainties remain.
Because of the tariff and because of the uncertainty and because of the slowing down of American economy, I think performances for the second quarter would not be as dramatic as first quarter, and possibly significantly lower than the first quarter.
The company's final earnings report will be released later this month. Shin Se-byuk, Arirang News.
The Foreign Ministry has launched a protest against Japan's false claim over South Korea's Dokdo Island. The protest follows Japan laying claim to Dokdo in its diplomatic blue book released on Tuesday. In response, the Foreign Ministry called in Taisuke Mibae, deputy head of mission at the Japanese embassy here in Seoul, to share its displeasure. In a separate statement, the ministry also stressed that Dokdo is South Korean territory, historically, geographically, and under international law, and that the government would respond firmly to any false claim over the island.
Korea will provide an additional $2 million worth of urgent relief items to Myanmar to aid its recovery after the recent deadly earthquake there. According to the Foreign Ministry, the items will include 500 camping tents for the displaced, 4,000 water bottles, and 80,000 blankets. This follows Seoul's initial $2 million worth of humanitarian assistance sent last week through the International Committee of the Red Cross. More than 10 days have passed since the massive quake, and as of Tuesday, the death toll stands at around 3,600. It is warm enough for the cherry blossoms to bloom. Seoul rose up to 19 degrees Celsius, and Yangsan in Gyeongsang-namdo province was as warm as 25 degrees Celsius today. It will continue to be warm tomorrow, with Seoul rising up to 18 degrees. The daily temperature difference will stay wide as well. Meanwhile, dry weather advisories are spreading. Dry weather advisories are in place in some parts of Gyeongsang-do provinces, southern parts of Chungcheongbuk-do province, eastern parts of Jeollado provinces, and the mountainous areas of Jeju Island. In addition, strong winds of more than 50 meters per second are blowing throughout the country. Please take extra precautions. Tomorrow's Seoul will start off at 8 degrees, Gyeongju at 5 degrees. Daily highs will move up to 19 degrees in Chuncheon, 22 degrees in Daejeon and Jeju. Starting from western parts of the country tomorrow afternoon, rain is forecast across the country tomorrow night. That's all for Korea. Here are the weather conditions around the world. That is Newscenter for tonight. Thank you for watching. A panel session up next.
How to survive in Korea. One room. So, you're surviving in Korea? If you signed a contract for a one room, obviously you're a pro. But the real deal begins now. Step 1. Housewarming. No need to buy toilet paper, diffusers or hand soap. You'll get them soon enough as housewarming gifts. And some are bound to pile up. There's nothing better to serve your guests than milpaeyu nabe. If you have Korean friends coming over, don't forget the extra garlic. Step 2. Garbage disposal. With great power comes great responsibility. You've had a good time, so let's get to work. It might be tempting to sweep everything into a trash can, but you have to separate your garbage. Not bothered? Beware that negligence is punished with a fine or public humiliation. Step 3. Drying rack. You're excited to live alone in Korea, but the fate of these items, hanger, storage, or a hanger. Go get fresh coffee outside. Jogging doesn't cost anything, and nothing beats instant rice. But keep one item around so that you don't get too lonely. Step 4. Pros of living alone. No mum. Cons of living alone. No mum. A new towel doesn't magically appear. You have to do the laundry regularly. If anyone gives a towel as a souvenir, take it. Get rid of mold immediately. Don't be lazy with the vacuum cleaner. Housework is an endless affair. Overwhelmed? Give your mum a call and thank her for everything she's done. Did you survive in your one room? Wait, you have an unwanted visitor. Call someone you fancy. Could be the right person for the job.
Welcome to Within the Frame, where we bring the most pressing issues across the globe into focus. I'm Kim Mo-gen. The Constitutional Court's unanimous decision to remove President Yoon Suk-yeol from office marked a significant turning point in South Korea's political landscape. While the ruling ended a 4-month-long impeachment process, it also set the stage for new questions about national unity, democratic resilience, and the future of political leadership. Public reaction over the weekend was active but largely restrained, with both pro- and anti-impeachment rallies taking place without major unrest. Now, at the same time, increased political engagement among younger generations and rising concerns over ideological polarization suggest deeper shifts underway in Korean society. To better understand the significance of this moment and what it may mean moving forward, we speak with two guests here in the studio with us. To my right is Hans Shuttle, Professor of Political Science at Yonsei University. Welcome to the program, Professor.
Hi, Mo-kyun. Thank you for having me.
And also joining us to my right is Seo Chan-seok, Associate Professor of Sociology at Chungang University. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me tonight.
So let's start our discussion with Professor Shuttle. So like I said last Friday, South Korea's Constitutional Court unanimously ruled to remove President Yoon from office. I must ask, how do you read into the significance of this latest decision?
Well, I think it was definitely a win for the rule of law, and I could even feel, I think, on the streets of my ordinary little quiet neighborhood, a collective sigh of relief after the decision came down that the country would move forward. I mean, anytime democracy goes through the process of impeaching and then potentially removing a president, it puts a cloud and a bit of uncertainty over the prospects for the country going forward, especially in South Korea's case, since it's only been a democracy for a generation and a half or so. We're basically going on our second and a half generation. And of course, we've been through in this country the impeachment process before, but to have the court come through with a unanimous decision, and one that was very well articulated and asserted what the Constitution calls for in a president, and then also clarified in detail how the December 3rd martial law decree from former President Yoon, and of course the attempt to shut down the National Assembly and the intrusion on the National Election Commission and the process in which all that was done, to make it very clear, I think crystal clear, to the public how the actions that night and how many of the actions accompanying that night were outside the boundaries of the Constitution. I think that sent a very strong message to the people of Korea. And I also noticed in the 24 hours after that, especially, and in some ways even continuing into this week, that globally the political reaction was also quite interested and supportive, I think, because in so many countries right now we hear talk and concern about democratic backsliding, and the research institutes that monitor the health of democracy around the world have been raising concern that autocracies, government, at the hands of a strong man as opposed to government really adhering to the rule of law, that this may be on the rise. But here was a case where an attempt at autocracy by, you could say, a rogue president, at least on the night of December 3rd here, was shut down by the court. And it was a combination, of course, of political institutions and people power that came together to make that happen.
Right, so we were clearly able to see how power of democracy was evident. Now to Professor Seo as well, even after the decision has been announced, pro and anti-impeachment rallies were held across Seoul over the weekend. Thankfully, the level of chaos was, not that extreme as expected. What do you think are the reasons behind this?
Yes, protests and demonstrations used to be violent under the military regime, but 35 years after the democratic transition in 1987, social movements are now perceived as a legitimate way for people to raise their voices and to make collective claims. So protest in South Korea generally is very peaceful compared to other countries. So yes, there were some violent incidents, such as a riot in front of the district court in Seoul. But generally speaking, both protests were very organized, and participants in both rallies were generally quite strategical, I think. The motive of protesters behind their decision to take part in these rallies were to influence the decision-making process of the judges in the Constitutional Court. So once the decision was made, they lost their motive. So I had this very unique opportunity with a dozen of student researchers to go to protest sites, both anti and pro-impeachment rallies. And at first, I was very worried about the safety of my student researchers, but it didn't take that long to realize the very peaceful atmosphere of both protests. So I think now social movement in South Korea are basically peaceful and organized.
Right, so the general atmosphere was largely peaceful and calm. Now, this impeachment process, it took a total of 123 days for Yoon to be removed since the martial law was declared on December 3rd. Now, based on the roughly 4-month-long process and public protests as well, Professor, what do you think this incident actually signifies for South Korean democracy?
Well, there's a term in political science called democratic consolidation, and there's a few different ways of understanding that, but one way of thinking about a democratic consolidation is if a democracy runs into a big test, and then how will the democracy survive that test? Will it survive that test with its institutions intact, or will it even come out stronger? There is the phrase in English, the saying in English, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. So sometimes when a democracy goes on trial, it may very well emerge from the trial more resilient than before. And of course, this country went through it in 2016, 2017 with former President Park Geun-hye. You know, I was here during that time period. So for me, it was a little bit almost of a deja vu. Even though the circumstances leading to the impeachment for each president were very, very different, the whole 4-month process and the Assembly's role and then the public's role and then, of course, going to the court, you know, I think for many Koreans it's become very familiar because it's been just the second time in roughly an 8-year period. I mean, we talk about guardrails of democracy and the importance of a constitution. If a president veers out of the boundaries of what the Constitution allows, then it's very important for the other branches of government to step in and protect the integrity of the system as much as possible. So that's what we saw first. Well, we saw it on the night of the martial law decree with the Assembly rejecting the martial law bid and then following up with impeachment motions and then, of course, waiting to see how the court would decide on that. And, of course, there was a lot of anxiety, I think, in the month leading up to the court's decision, but very clearly the court, I think, because there were so many contested aspects of the claims in the impeachment motion, and you had different, as we've already discussed tonight, you had competing social movements on the street. In this case, unlike President Park Geun-hye, this time President Yoon, former President Yoon, had a growing chorus of supporters rallying around him. So I think it was very important for the court to answer back and make a very clear stand on what was constitutional and what was not. Because it was worrying, again, there's something different this time in January, when the courthouse itself got attacked around the time that President Yoon was detained. That was something that we didn't see in an earlier time period. And protesters supporting the impeached president taking cues from U.S. President Donald Trump's movement, you know, the Stop the Steal sign. Stop the Steal in the U.S. after the 2020 election was actually based on lies. So there was some concern, I think, that, you know, is there a movement here in Korea playing the same game that might not necessarily be productive for having a more healing conversation on where to take the country and the country's young democracy once things get settled down. So there was some uncertainty with that, but I think the court in its decision put the country on a much clearer course again toward democratic resilience going forward.
Right, so it took a long time, but perhaps this one, it reaffirmed the democratic resilience in this difficult time. Now, notably, rallies for and against Yoon's impeachment showed a sharp increase in political participation from people in their 20s and 30s. Now, this generation had once been dubbed politically indifferent generation. Professor Seo, how could this surge in political engagement among these young people be analyzed first?
For young people, actually, engaging in protests is actually not a big deal. It's not a special thing for them. It's just a typical way for them to express their opinion. So they saw how the candlelight protests led to the impeachment of President Park in 2016 during their childhood. And they also saw how the victims of sexual violence finally raised their voices in the Me Too movement in 2018. And in annual protests such as Queer Parade or climate justice action, we always see high turnout rate of young population in those protests. So these young people just find this political moment as another opportunity for them to engage and to raise their voices. So from now on, I think young people being politically indifferent is not an accurate statement. Now, for both progressive and conservative, it would be very critical for them to successfully mobilize and recruit these young people in their movement.
Right, so it was really a natural thing for these young people to, learn about these through a lot of incidents that happened throughout their lifetime, right?
Yes, yes.
Now, Professor Shadow, with this kind of shift in political landscape, how do you foresee this increased participation among younger generations change South Korea's political landscape?
Well, first of all, Mo-kyun, it's great that we see more young people interested in politics and actively engaged again, as Professor Saw was saying. Now, certainly in the 2022 election, we began to really notice that there were patterns emerging with men, say under 30, voting more heavily, not exclusively for former President Yoon, and then we saw women voting more heavily, although not exclusively, for the challenger at that time, Lee Jae-myung, who may very well be the Democratic Party's candidate this time around. I think the ratio is about 60-40 in that election, which was unusual because in previous presidential elections, we saw differing perspectives and differing levels of support for candidates, generation to generation, but not with men versus women in the same generation. And I think whether that generational divide combined with a gender divide among younger voters, whether that continues really will depend on how the political parties present themselves going forward in the election campaign. Last time around in 2022, I felt as if the messages the two parties were sending about a lot of key domestic issues on the economy were not all that different. And I mean, both parties, for instance, were very concerned about the lack of affordable housing or underemployment among young adults or the challenges it takes to get families off the ground these days, a challenge that's related to the declining birth rate here. The parties were very responsive, trying very hard to be responsive, I think, to younger voters. But I think the voters saw personality differences with the two candidates and differences in temperament and tone and even differences in the gender issue itself and how the candidates portrayed themselves. So we'll have to see what kinds of candidates end up going forward this time in the election and then how younger men and women respond to those candidates. And also, are they enthusiastic about voting and getting behind one or both of the candidates in the coming elections. So it's definitely important for the younger voters to make their voices heard, as it is for all voters in a democracy to make their voices heard. But I think the voters will be reflecting back on what kinds of signals are being sent to them by the candidates and the parties over the next few months.
So this phenomenon would bring significant changes ahead, not just in voting, but also in part of political strategies also as well.
It could be an exciting time.
Now, let's also touch upon this national reconciliation theme. It has been a pressing issue since this impeachment happened. There are growing concerns that ideological divide between progressives and conservatives has reached a peak through this latest incident. How do you assess the current situation?
Well, it's time for the parties to diffuse those kinds of tensions or do what they can to diffuse them instead of inflaming them, I think. And of course, it's tempting for political parties to try to press all the buttons of the voters that will anger them. But I think in this case, both political parties should really try to send a much more positive message going forward. It's one thing to build a negative coalition to support a political party when that party is campaigning against something. So in the case of the Democratic Party, they have been, campaigning against the PPP, the party in power. But now the Democratic Party is going to have to campaign about positively where they want to take the country. And likewise, the People Power Party, if they keep that name going forward, they typically rebrand themselves. They're going to have a lot of explaining to do this time around, as we know, because this is the second time in a row that a president from their party has left office early and in disgrace and impeached. And I think one thing that voters might have in the backs of their minds, and this may be across partisan divides or gender differences in perspectives or generational divides, all the usual kinds of cleavages, or even regional divisions, I think that one thing that voters in Korea might end up agreeing on this time is that they will want to find a candidate who is not going to get impeached in the next presidency. a candidate that hopefully will maintain the integrity and credibility as the country's next president. You know, there were candidates who ran for office in 2017 after the impeachment of Park Geun-hye. I'm thinking in particular An Hee-jung. If he had been elected, there were scandals about him that emerged in the years that followed. He might have well been impeached if he had been successful. So vetting the candidates is going to be very important for the political parties. And I think if the right candidates come forward with these kinds of positive messages, that might diffuse the kind of polarization and energize voters so they can think more positively about the future and what's important in the country's interests for the future.
So with this situation, you know, it's at a peak. This ideological divide is at a peak. Some people say that this polarization is triggering other kinds of, you know, social conflict as well. Professor Seo, which areas should we be a little bit more concerned about?
Yeah, regarding heightened political polarization, my main concern is to see the non-political policies turning into political ones. So this process of politicization. So here I'm thinking of environmental policies in the United States, for example. Environmental policies are necessary to deal with this global level climate crisis. But once the environmental issues become politicized, now the policies lost its bipartisan support. Same goes for gender policies in South Korea that I am focusing on. South Korea has historically been under the patriarchal system for a long time, and gender inequality still persists in our society and our economy. And the government actually has that responsibility to guarantee equal rights and opportunities for everyone, regardless of their sexual or gender identities. But once the gender issues become politicized, now it lost widespread support. So once I will say spillover effect of political polarization into social polarization, where political polarization can easily turn into social level polarization based on people's social backgrounds.
Right, so it's a very concerning situation. You know, these divides could spill over into areas like gender and generational tensions as well. Now, the impeachment, Professor Shuttle, has now brought South Korea into an early presidential election phase. And there are concerns that the coming election might be just as divisive as the impeachment process itself. What kind of steps do you think could political leaders do to reduce these polarization during this time around?
Well, if we're talking about political leadership, one thing that's going to be, I think, very important from the outgoing president, again, former President Yoon, is to stay out of the limelight. And I have noticed in the last few days that conservative media, in particular the Jungang-ilbo, for instance, had an editorial, very worried editorial, arguing that President Yoon has not yet fully apologized or taken responsibility for the mistakes that led to his impeachment, and that there is the chance, as long as he doesn't own up to what happened. I think that Jungang-ilbo was pointing out, as a fairly conservative news organization here, that there is a risk for the former ruling party that the litigation in the society over Yoon Suk-yeol among his supporters will continue to haunt the party and haunt the election going forward. So, you know, certainly the PPP is going to have to turn over a new leaf very quickly. Otherwise, there could be the ghost of a former president kind of looming over the next election in a way that didn't happen last time. Last time, former President Park Geun-hye, after she was impeached and removed from office, she moved out of the Blue House, and you know, her case continued legally, but it didn't really overshadow the election, at least as I remember it. So the question is, will the wreckage of this former presidency continue to loom over the election? I think the party will want to go in a new direction. And of course, Lee Jae-myung on the Democratic Party side, he's not entirely out of the woods either. There are a lot of questions that he will have to face and his supporters will have to face. I think both parties, again, have to look very carefully at what kinds of candidates they put forward. But when assuming all that is said and done and goes forward favorably, then any any democracy looking at election going forward in this day and age, I would say one is for the candidates to be positive. Again, as I said a moment ago, it's one thing for a negative coalition to overturn a government that they don't like. It's another for a political party or a collection of social movements and, in a sense, all the political actors aligned with a certain cause working together to come up with a positive vision for where they want the country to go, and then communicate that vision to the public in a way that will rally the public behind them and make that vision work long-term once in office. That was the hope, say, in the U.S. when former President Biden won the election in 2020. There was a coalition that he was trying to build, but whatever positive message he was trying to put together didn't last through the 2024 election. And we saw what happened. The Democrats lost power in 2024 because they couldn't translate that vision into something more long-lasting. So both political parties here will have that same kind of challenge to articulate a positive vision and then also to be protective of the country's interests. South Korea is in a tough neighborhood, and the international situation is not easy right now. And Xi Jinping is not easy to work with. Vladimir Putin's not easy to deal with. We'll see who's running Japan in the next couple of years. Of course, President Trump in the U.S. is not easy to work with, and Kim Jong-un raises his own set of issues. So both candidates are going to have to make an appeal to the public that they have not only a vision but a strategy on where to take this country forward in the next few years, and we'll see which candidate prevails.
So putting aside political wrangling and focusing on the country's interests would be key. Now, foreign media outlets have warned that in the short term, South Korea society may become even more polarized following this impeachment incident. Professor Seo, given the country's heightened political divisions, what kind of efforts do you think are needed to achieve social cohesion?
Yeah, the declaration of the martial law obviously intensified political polarization, and it's very understandable to be worried about the situation. But at the same time, I could see many people who have relatively moderate views from both progressive and conservative camps who feel very tired about this ongoing conflict. And interestingly, this fatigue is could be a treatment for any sort of conflict. So during the election and even after the election, I really hope that political candidates try to find some constructive way to persuade moderate voters using policy platforms rather than relying on that old, destructive, and exhaustive tactics to demonize each other. So on top of what Professor Seo mentioned, I really hope that the role of politicians will be very critical during and after the election.
Right, so this really goes in line with Professor Seo's comments. So we hope the next 2 months we'll see a lot of focus on campaigning towards political policies and to better shape the government's next few years to come. Now, we will have to wrap up our discussion at this point, but thank you so much for your insights tonight, Professor Seo.
Thank you for having me, Myo-Kyun.
And also Professor Seo.
Thank you very much.
That'll be all from us on Within the Frame tonight. Be sure to tune in again next time as we continue to explore the stories that matter. Until then, stay informed and engaged.